Joining us now here is Dr. Erin Philpott and Dr. Brad Greenberg from San Juan Regional Medical Center. Good morning, doctors.
Good morning.
Great to have you with us again. So I want to kick this off with questions about vaccines. We have a lot of new reports coming out about vaccines being maybe 50% effective, and so I know that that's a little irksome from some folks. It sounds like you could just flip a coin in a crowd of 100 and maybe 50 will be actually vaccinated successfully, and so I just want to hear you guys' update on that.
Yeah, I'll take that one. This is Dr. Philpott. So the FDA requires for approval in the United States that the coronavirus vaccines are at least 50% effective at minimum. So I think, obviously the more effective the vaccine, the better. But I think looking at flu vaccines and how they're matched each season, they're not always a great match. But they still provide an incredible effect on mortality related to flu, hospitalizations related to flu, and overall severity of illness related to flu. So I think even if the vaccines just are attenuating illness or preventing hospitalizations or preventing some of these long-term coronavirus effects, that they could be very efficacious. But, obviously, the more effective, the better.
Right. And so let's actually broach people's fears. There's also been some polls taken about how comfortable Americans would feel if the vaccine came out, receiving the vaccine. Can we speak more to that?
Sure.
Would it be okay to comment? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Would it be okay to comment on or further expand on the sort of the overview of the vaccine?
Yes.
Because right now there's a boatload of vaccines, and even though there's some concern that one vaccine may not necessarily be as effective, we're still in the trial phases here, where really we're trying to understand and make sure that the vaccines are safe and effective. And this is not like this is a one-shot deal here, no pun intended. This is like 40 vaccines are currently in clinical trials in people. And there's 92 additional preclinical vaccines that are basically working with animals. And, there's these, tier after tier of these, what we call phases with the normal FDA approvals, and all of these different vaccines are in different phases. But I think one thing that's very important is that not every vaccine has the same approach. And so just because one vaccine isn't turning out to be as promising as we hoped, there's a whole range of other approaches to the actual pieces of the virus that we're trying to generate an immune response for. Because there's genetic vaccines, there's protein-based vaccines, there's also viral vector based vaccines, which are related to how the viruses get into cells. And there's really company after company working on this particular problem. And even when we look at decisions that I think are happening outside the United States, the biggest one that we sort of wonder and what the decision making was what happened in Russia, for example. And even there's published research now which basically looks at even what we would consider phase 1 or safety-based testing and phase 1 or phase 2 testing for that vaccine in Russia. It looks like there aren't really any adverse events. So, but there is simultaneous work happening with dozens of vaccines around the world. And it really is kind of a race to see who can make a vaccine which is going to be safe and effective, and then figure out how to distribute the vaccine, which is a total different real challenge from a population health perspective. So I think the most important thing here is that we don't have all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak. And just because we're hearing news that we may not necessarily like to hear, I hope everyone can feel confident that there is a worldwide effort to try to solve this and to try to do this in a meaningful way, which is going to have a lasting and a meaningful impact.
That's a good point, Dr. Greenberg. Thank you. And I wanted to ask you both as well about this work on these vaccines when we see multiple vaccines and trials going on at the same time from different companies or maybe competing companies or countries. All this work is going so fast. I mean, really, from the development of other vaccines, this is really at a breakneck speed. Can the public be assured that all the vaccines that do get released to the public are going to be safe or effective? I guess that's what these trials are all about, right? That's why they do this.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Scott. I think the Sputnik 5, which is the Russian vaccine, there is a little bit, the world's looking that way to see what's going on and what's going to happen. It was released before the phase 3 trial, I believe the phase 3 trial where they look for safety and efficacy in large populations of people, pulling in different groups of people, including older folks, pregnant people, and broadening sort of the group a little bit. So I think, in our country, the FDA, it's important to know that these different bodies, scientific bodies or the FDA governing bodies, are hopefully separate from politics and have put these structures in place to ensure that this is a rigorous process. The phase 1 and phase 2 trials have most certainly been complete without cutting corners, but very quickly due to the need for this. And then it will be really important to see the results from those phase 3 trials before the vaccine is released to the public. So I think the structure is there, and if carried out, the public can be reassured that the vaccine safety is there. And I know Megan was referring maybe to the Gallup poll where I think it was 1 in 3 Americans said they probably would not get the vaccine at this point in time. There's a large population of anti-vaxxers in the United States, or people who have overall distrust or mistrust in vaccines and how they're administered. But again, it's a big process. There are sometimes adverse effects with vaccines in large populations of people. And I think, it's a different way for Americans to think about focusing on public health and protecting each other at the risk of even if it's a very low risk of a possible adverse event for themselves personally. But I think that the measures, the safety measures are in place, and hopefully the different companies will carry them out, and our FDA and government and everyone alike will come through for us and provide a safe and effective vaccine, or multiple vaccines, hopefully.
Right. Thank you. And that's a good point. And I wanted to ask you one final question about vaccines, at least for me, that as these start to get rolled out, I think folks are starting now to think about that whole process, right? How do you get a vaccine out to 300 million people in one country, or things like that? Would they roll out? I guess the only thing we have to compare it to maybe is like a flu shot, like a flu vaccine, when we try to inoculate the entire population in this country. Is that how you think they could do this?
So I think that, great question, Scott. And I think that one thing that I hope that folks can be reassured with is that this is not the first time that we've tried to think about how to distribute large amounts of either antidote or vaccine to populations. There's large-scale federal efforts to basically develop what are called pods, or points of distribution. And their whole community programs, one of them, the bigger ones, was called the Community Readiness Initiative. And that was essentially an effort to try to figure out how to deal with either a chemical or a biological event, or the need to distribute basically antidote, antibiotics, or vaccination. And so right now there's currently work trying to adapt some of these models for large-scale vaccination processes. And lots of places around the country are trying to use flu vaccine, which I think is very important for everyone to get. But using flu vaccine and flu vaccination is almost like a dry run for how they're going to do things with the novel COVID vaccine. And so I think there's lots of work around this, but the challenge is real. Some people have described this moonshot idea of trying to make a vaccine for COVID in such a short time frame is mirrored only in complexity by the desire to vaccinate 350 million people, or you could say a good proportion of 7 billion people in a short time frame. So I think that there's definitely lots of complexity to it. But it's one of those things that there's a lot of work right now, forward-thinking work right now, to try to identify how to do so and be effective.
Sure, that makes sense. And so switching gears here, and we already had me rant on Monday about frat parties, so we're going to set aside how young people are.
How could we forget?
How could we forget? You guys might want to go back and roll the tapes on that. But we do have an increase in cases in young people, and so I'm wondering, with that, if we have an increase in knowledge yet about how the virus might be impacting young people. Are there lasting effects that we're seeing there? Maybe Dr. Philpott, you could speak to that.
Sure. Yeah, Scott and I had kind of touched on that a couple of weeks ago. We are having increasing data come out about these long-term effects associated with COVID, even in those who have mild or moderate illness and never land in the hospital. Some of the effects there include damage to the heart or inflammation of the heart muscle. There's been it's sports physical time, and this is certainly not my field of expertise being an adult doctor, but a lot of the younger population is going and getting sports physicals to get approved for participation, and they're looking at the different effects of COVID and are actually finding on cardiac MRIs that there is some residual damage, demonstrating that there is this viral myocarditis that's taking place. So that's pretty concerning. I know there's some professional athletes as well who have had this take place, who have been, infected with COVID and recovered, and then are seeing sort of the long-term ramifications of cardiac involvement. There's also long-term or people with protracted shortness of breath and just generalized fatigue, kind of abnormal heart rhythms going up to really fast heart rates. And yet to be elucidated exactly the cause and the etiology of some of these signs and symptoms after COVID, but most certainly there and concerning, because we don't know how this impact on the lungs might predispose you even to a more severe influenza or pneumonia in the future, which could be, obviously even more concerning for a respiratory season coming up. There's long-term neurologic effects as well. And we kind of talked about that a little bit, people with prolonged delirium and just kind of this foggy brain. And then some other kind of autoimmune features going on as well. Anything else to add to that, Dr. Greenberg?
I think as we begin to understand just the nature of the impact across populations, and we really have to acknowledge that the virus doesn't affect every individual in the same way. But we're a long way from really understanding why that's the case. And we're still pretty far away from understanding how the COVID-19 syndrome affects different areas of the body in different ways. And so I think what is very important for everyone to understand is that there's a lot of value in not getting sick in the first place. Medicine will catch up with this, but it's going to take quite a while to really understand. But right now, the things that exist in every person's armamentarium are social distancing, wearing a mask, and really exercising really good judgment to make sure that they're and engaging in COVID-safe practices and avoiding getting sick is definitely what I think is the best practice right now, because it's not just the elderly or the infirm that can suffer consequences from this illness. And so I think that it's important for everyone to understand that and stay the course, stay aware of what's going on, use the appropriate personal protective equipment, and we'll do our best within medicine to do the right kind of science to understand why and to develop meaningful diagnostic and therapeutic approaches.
It's a really good point and a good reminder, Dr. Greenberg. Thank you. And I wanted to ask both of you, I know I said we were done with vaccine questions, but one more came to mind because it was announced recently that the Navajo Nation was going to have some of its population take part in some of these trials clinical trials for a vaccine or a series of vaccines or what have you. From your perspective, and both of you, please answer this question: is this a good thing maybe for our neighbors to be part of this? Could this help get things into the population faster and maybe help? Of course, we've seen the numbers on the reservation that were so high at the very beginning of this pandemic, and now they've kind of calmed down, of which we're all very grateful. But what about having these trials so close to home?
I can start with that one. Yeah, I think, the participation of minority populations in these trials is very important because they're often underrepresented. And as we saw through our initial surge with the Navajo Nation so highly impacted with so many cases and so many deaths, the severity of illness, the rates of hospitalization were significantly higher among the Navajo population. I believe the death rate was 23 times in Navajos above Caucasians. And then I think the hospitalization rate was 763 to 100,000 compared to 21 per 100,000 of Navajos versus Caucasians, or that might have been Native Americans more generally rather than Navajos. But regardless, I think it's clear that this is really impacting different racial, ethnic backgrounds differently. So I do think it's important that they're represented in these different clinical trials. I think we have a long history of minority distrust of the medical establishment for good reasons. And I think that's often reflected in the choice to participate, like flu vaccine rates are quite a bit lower among minority populations, probably driven by a number of different factors. So I think it's really important to be thoughtful and ethical in how all these trials are conducted, but most certainly to involve minority populations so they can understand that they have the same safety and efficacy as all populations when looking at the data.
Dr. Greenberg, do you have anything to add?
I just think that, like Dr. Philpott was saying, it's important as we move forward to address some either vulnerable populations or underrepresented populations to assure safety and efficacy. Another big group that is often neglected, especially during the initial time frame for vaccine trials, is children. And so we need to make sure that we do appropriate testing to assure safety and efficacy in all of these subpopulations. And I think it's really important that we are conscious of the decisions to include underrepresented groups as we move forward.
Well, thank you. That is super important to hear about underrepresented populations. And as always, doctors, it's a pleasure to get to speak with you all. We know that you're busy over there on the front lines, of course. And so thanks for calling in again.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. Thank you.